Facebook has established a history of, I hate to like be so damning, but they keep lying to the public. Like there is, you can do a lot of good. For every single whistleblower, whistleblowing is never plan A or B, or even like C or D. It's like E, F, or G, because, you know, whistleblowing is scary. Like, no one wants to blow the whistle. It's just at some point you start living with a secret that you think could impact the lives of millions of people. And there's like, at some point you can't live with that pain anymore. And so you have to do something.
But did it happen very soon after you entered the company, or did it take months to, you know, slowly realize what was going on? How would you describe it? And was there some moment where you decided it cannot continue like that? I mean,
sure. I was very shocked at how bad it was almost immediately. Like I came in, you know, having seen the harms of misinformation in the United States, and I had no idea how much worse it was outside the United States, right? Like I'm an American, like I live in a bubble. But I didn't really lose faith in Facebook until they dissolved civic integrity. So there used to be a part of the company that was focused on making sure Facebook was a constructive force in the world, in society. You know, positive force in elections, that kind of thing. And they dissolved it right after the US 2020 election. And I don't think I'm the only one who kind of lost faith at that point. Like I didn't start collecting documents right away. Like I had to figure out how to do things, right? Because I had to be careful. I had to think for a long time. But that other people also like left in high numbers. Like when I left, the pod that I was part of was probably 75% people from civic integrity. So this is like 7 or 8 product managers, program managers. And all of us left for either other places in the company or left the company entirely over a 6-week span. And so, you know, I don't think I was the only one who was discouraged by civic integrity being dissolved.
Is the fact that those conversations are happening enough to justify the risks that you took? Or do you feel like you're not going to rest until there is legal change and then that will be enough? Or is it something else that you're looking for?
During my time at Facebook, I became aware that so I haven't worked at one social media company. I've worked at 4 social media companies, right? And I have specifically worked as an algorithmic product person at multiple companies. And what I saw at Facebook was substantially worse than I had seen at other places. And because Facebook bought the right to be the internet in some of the most fragile places in the world, right? So they subsidized your internet if you used Facebook, but if you wanted to use the open and free internet, you had to pay. And so now, for the majority of languages in the world, 80 to 90% of the content is on Facebook. When Facebook did that, they took on a higher level of responsibility because there isn't an alternative now. And what I saw was, I think there's a million, maybe millions, maybe tens of millions of lives on the line because of Facebook's tendency to give the most reach to the most extreme content. And so compared to any risk I could face, that's just not worth 1 million lives. It's not worth 10 million lives. And so, yeah, I want to keep pushing. Like I want to start a youth movement. Like I want to give, I want young people not to feel powerless with I want young people not to feel powerless with regard to big platforms. There's lots of things that they could do. I want to work on how do we teach about social networks. So right now, if you want to take a lab, if you want to be a chemist, there are lots of lab classes you can take in college where you blow stuff up, you breathe in stuff you shouldn't breathe in. But if you want to be an algorithmic engineer, you want to be a data scientist, there aren't really lab classes. And if we had simulated social networks, both academics could study them and be like, oh, interesting, this is how we could disrupt the dynamics of the bad things on the network. But it also means that we could teach lab classes where, you know, 19-year-olds could come in and really analyze experiments, run experiments. And I think that would change people's perspectives, and it would give us a whole new generation of security professionals. Because right now, the only way you really can get this job is by being trained inside one of these companies. And so I think all of us will be safer if we have a broader ecosystem of like a public muscle for accountability.
There's a lot of elections coming up around the world next year. South Korea, in France.
Yeah.
I think there are more elections in the US coming up. What kind of risks does the way that social media, and specifically Facebook, the way that it operates right now,
Sure. I'll give you a really concrete example. This is probably one of the things I'm most concerned on. So we talked about the idea of engagement-based ranking. So Mark Zuckerberg in 2018 came out and said, engagement-based ranking, that's where you prioritize what content goes in your newsfeed based on its ability to provoke a reaction from you. You get a comment, get a reshare. He said engagement-based ranking is dangerous because people are drawn to interact with extreme content, even though when we ask them later, did you like this content, they say no. And he said, but don't worry, AI will save us. The problem with a strategy like that is engagement-based ranking has problems all over the product. And one of the places where it is most acute for democracy is when you run an ad, that same engagement-based ranking is used to price the ad. So an ad that provokes more comments, more reshares, more clicks is a cheaper ad than an ad that doesn't do that. And as a result, you end up subsidizing hate and division, right? Because an ad that is hateful or divisive is going to be 5 to 10 times cheaper than an ad that is compassionate or empathetic, because it's hard to provoke a reaction for empathy. And so I'm advocating for flat rates on political ads. Like there should be some cost per impression, and that's just what it is. Because otherwise we end up giving a subsidy to people who want to tear our society apart. And so that's an example of something where like that's going to unquestionably play a role in both the French election, the South Korean election, right? Because if people know they get a discount for going dark, like that's a problem, because we give 5 to 10 times much more reach, effectively per dollar, for things that are going to pull us apart instead of pull us together. The second question is around the weaponization of the platform. So the number of threat intelligence people that they have who are like looking for networks of influence operations and the like is very small. So there were only 17 people on that team when I left. And Facebook claims they have 200 people working on this. Maybe, who knows? I want them to articulate exactly what do those people do. Because when I worked at Google, they published how many women they had in tech, or on their tech staff. And they included secretaries for engineers in their count of women who were technical staff. So it's one of these things where you have to say, like, what's the job of those 200 people? What are they actually doing? Because Facebook will just dance with the data otherwise. And so what that means is when you only have 17 people, like when I worked in counterespionage, we had like maybe 6 people, maybe 7 people. And at any given time, we could only work on 1/3 of the cases we had because we just didn't have staff. And so we never built a detector to proactively find more espionage because we already couldn't deal with the cases that we had.
What is counterespionage? I didn't. I heard you say that.
Yeah.
What is it?
So there are nation states that use Facebook, but there's also private firms that use Facebook to do surveillance to compromise individual users. So for example, a nation state might send spyware that will compromise someone's phone. Because if you compromise a phone, you can compromise a community. Because you get their address book, now you know a bunch of people. You can get their pictures, which can have geolocated information usually. So now you know where do they congregate, what are they interested in. Yeah, it's very problematic. You might be able to spy on their phone calls at that point. And so we would monitor for teams that would do these things. And sometimes they would be against other countries' militaries. You know, they'd pretend to be a pretty girl and like try to make friends with someone and send them spyware. And so it's one of these things where that's what our team did, was look for those. But in the case of information operations, they're looking for coordinated efforts to send misinformation, disinformation, sometimes to targeted populations. So for example, the team I worked on early in my time at Facebook was called narrowcast misinformation. So there's viral misinformation that goes out to lots of people, and there's narrowcast misinformation that goes to a targeted population. And like that project was started because Russia was targeting police officers, African-American activists, environmentalists, gay activists. And that's because all those groups are leaders in their communities, respectively. Also, think about what that means, like targeted misinformation to police officers, like people with guns. Like that's a real thing. They also target militaries, right? So when you underfund people working on information operations, influence operations, that has serious national security implications. And so I'm a big proponent that Facebook, if Facebook wants to stay behind the wall and do all of it themselves, they should have to disclose which teams exist for threat intelligence, and how many people work on them, and what their jobs are. Because right now, we know there's a counterterrorism team, and we know there's a counter-information operations team, and a counter-espionage team. There's also human trafficking, or human exploitation more generally, children. But we don't know how many people work on those teams. And when you only have maybe 6 or 7 people for espionage all around the world, I don't think that's enough. Because think about it, Russia and China have 10,000 people each doing misinformation and espionage and the like. And so, I don't know, it's a problem. We need more transparency.
That point that you just made, some people have taken it a little bit further and said, well, maybe we should be regulating algorithms in some way. How do you feel about that?
So regulating algorithms, I think that's, so we can't think of algorithms in isolation. So algorithms work in concert with product changes. So I'll give you an example. Facebook did a product change where instead of having to reshare over and over again to different groups, they made a picker so you could reshare it up to 10 groups at a time. And when they did it, they never thought that it might increase misinformation. But many months down the road, there was a surge in misinformation, and they traced it back to, they had made it so much easier to reshare into these large groups. I think if we just come in and say, we are going to regulate algorithms, like that is so amorphous. And I think it's more powerful to say, hey, Facebook, you have a lot more transparency than we do. You need to let us know what you're worrying about. But the other reality is we can learn a lot from people's experiences of these products. So one of my favorite misinformation researchers is actually an anthropologist. She's not a data scientist. And the way she learns about new misinformation techniques is she literally sits down with young people, with old people, and she says, show me your newsfeed. Can you explain it to me? What do you see? And so there's a lot that we can do to understand algorithms just from talking to people.
The mechanism you describe sounds really good. Do you think it should be up to companies to be like, yes, okay, we will bend to public pressure and pressure from experts and do this, or should we be legally forcing companies like Facebook to introduce this kind of mechanism?
I think we need to legally require it because companies like Facebook specifically, I don't know about other companies, Facebook has established a history of, I hate to be so damning, but they keep lying to the public. Like omissions and lies seem to be the pattern at Facebook. And I think unless there is a legally mandated process, I don't think we can trust what the results of it will be.
Here in Europe, it's generally seen as like Europe being fairly well ahead in terms of thinking about how to regulate AI, thinking about how to regulate tech in general. But it also feels like as soon as we've worked out how to regulate something in Europe, the situation has already moved on.
Yeah.
Is that going to happen again here?
So part of why I'm against the government coming in and saying, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, is exactly that happens. Like they put a fence in and tech walks around the fence. When you have a system that repeats every 6 months where you have to articulate the harms, everyone else gets to articulate the harms, and you have to say how you're going to fix them, let's imagine the metaverse for just 1 second.
Hey, and welcome to Connect. Today, we're going to talk about the metaverse.
So one of the things I'm most scared about the metaverse is when you put on your VR headset, your avatar is a little more handsome, a little more pretty than you are, better haircut, better clothes, nicer apartment. So let's say you get to the end of your evening, you came home from work, you put it on, time to brush your teeth, and you look in the mirror, and you're just not as pretty or as handsome as you were in VR. And, maybe a little bit more weight, less muscle. Your clothes are definitely not as nice. What does that do to a person if that's what happens every night? And I think it's one of those things where right now, I have not heard Facebook articulate how they're going to deal with that harm. But if they had to do a risk assessment 3 months from now, because now they have this new product, and they had to, and maybe they didn't even articulate it because they're too techno-optimistic. But if someone else said, hey, what are you going to do about the fact that people have massive incentives not to take off these VR headsets? What are you going to do? What are you going to do about people hating themselves more because you're providing a virtual version of them that's nicer? And I guarantee you that's not on Facebook's radar right now. But if they had to now sit down with a team and say, okay, what would we do about this? That would cut the current cycle. So the current thing that happens is tech platforms do these things, and 5 years down the road, they get so bad that we can't ignore them anymore. That we get enough anecdotal evidence in society that we can put pressures on the company. But if you have a system like this, company, community, accountability, you cut that cycle. And we could have that conversation 3 months from now, not 5 years from now. And I think that's how we stay in lockstep with technology.
So you want Facebook to engage right now on a conversation on
Yeah.
the metaverse and
I do.
what effect it could have on the people?
Yeah, they should. Like they're about to invest 10,000 engineers in this. Isn't that a conversation we should have now? I also think like the fact that they can find 10,000 engineers to invest in the metaverse and they can't find 3,000 more engineers to focus on safety, like I think that's also unacceptable, but that's a different issue. Yeah, like another issue with the metaverse that I'm really worried about, like I would love to get articulated probably by the community, is so to do metaverse, you have to put in more microphones, more sensors from a company that has shown they lie whenever it's in their benefit in your home. And if you choose to not have it in your home, I hope the company you work for doesn't choose for you, right? Because let's say you work from home and one day your company goes, hey, we're a metaverse company now. You could be forced to choose between like your livelihood and having a whole bunch of sensors from Facebook in your home. Shouldn't we talk about that now before it becomes a giant product? And if we had a system like this, so company, community, accountability, we would have this conversation now. But if we don't have a framework like this, Facebook's not going to have that conversation.
Knowing what we all know now as a result of these documents, what is your advice for everyday, normal social media users in terms of how they might change their behavior?
Excellent. I think it's good to be mindful on how much time you spend on these things. So a lot of phones now tell you how much time you spend on apps per day. I think sometimes people might be surprised if they saw how much they did. I think if you have kids, one of the top things you can do is there's rate limiting software. So there's software that will like give them a budget every day of 2 hours or something. Because the thing that's happening with both kids and adults is sometimes they develop self-soothing patterns where they get depressed, they get anxious, and the way they soothe is they just keep scrolling and dissociate, disconnect. But if the thing that's causing you to be anxious or depressed is the content, that's a problem. And Facebook knows that adults have this problem. They know that kids have this problem, and they also know that when kids try to talk to their parents about their usage, kids say, I know this makes me unhappy, I can't stop, if I leave I'll be ostracized. And because parents have never lived this experience, they sometimes give advice that makes kids feel really alone. And this is all in Facebook's documents. When a parent says, why don't you just not use it? That can make the kid feel like it's their fault that they're having these experiences. Or they can feel just alone, like they can't tell their parents about it. And so I think approaching young people, particularly from a place of listening and like trying to refrain from judgment and like come up with solutions together on like how to support them and move forward. Because there's this thing called network effects where for every additional person you add to a product, it becomes more valuable. This is happening to our kids. Every additional kid in the school that goes on Instagram makes it more of a demand to have the other kids on. And so unless we do movements at schools where we say, this whole school, we're making a choice to go off Instagram together. We'll still SMS, but we're not doing Instagram anymore, which is a real thing. Like at some privileged schools in the Bay Area, places that executives send their kids to, the norm established in the schools is we just don't do that. Like we don't do social media. And so these are all choices we can make, but it's hard for us to make them individually. And so we have to, solve problems together, not solve them alone.
Not quite sure how much time we have left. I only had one final question, which was, Facebook has got over scandals before. Does it feel like this time it's different?
I do think there's an opportunity this time in terms of before, we didn't really have a broad swath of harms, right? Like one of the things my disclosures show is a pattern of repeated behavior where over and over again, Facebook chose profit over people. And so it's hard to ignore it. It's not just like a scandal, like, oh no, yeah, we learned again, Facebook is bad. Like this time there's enough to say, no, there's like problems with how Facebook is organized. Like Facebook is not gonna solve this on their own. And I've talked to a number of governmental regulators who said that this disclosure just changed the entire tone of the debate. And so my hope is that this time will be different. And I have a really long view on it, right? Like part of why I want to, found a social movement is, maybe we do have to push for a couple of years. Maybe we have to push for 5 years. I'm not going to get, distraught if the story fades a little bit in the coming weeks because I have a long-term view.